He bought her for $60. A transaction whispered in the dusty air of the tavern, sealing a fate no child should endure. But as the coins clinked, an unexpected question broke the suffocating silence. A question that offered a sliver of choice where none should exist. May I take her? Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Ilara, her small hands clutching the rough-spun skirt, felt the floorboards tremble beneath her. Not from her own fear, though that was a cold knot in her belly, but from the stomping boots of the men who had decided her fate. $60. A sum too small to buy a good horse, yet enough, apparently, to buy a life. Her father, slouched against the counter, a haze of cheap whiskey clinging to him like a shroud, had simply nodded. Her mother, long gone, had left only the memory of soft whispers and a profound absence. Ilara knew what unwanted felt like. It was a weight pressed upon her chest, stealing the air from her lungs, making every breath a shallow thing. She'd learned early to live in silence, not just because her ears could not catch the careless words of men, but because silence offered a deceptive shield. It was easier to be unheard, unseen, to carry the burden of existence without attracting the cruel gaze of a world that offered only scorn. The man who had bought her was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow. John. He didn't look at her like the others, with pity or contempt, but with a quiet, almost hesitant curiosity. His voice, when he spoke, was a rumbling vibration in the tavern's murky air, a sound she felt more than heard. "May I take her?" he had asked. Not her father, but her. A question that sliced through the thick despair, leaving a thin, ragged wound of uncertainty. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. It was a choice. A faint flicker of agency in a life defined by its absence. She had merely nodded, a jerky motion of her head, her eyes fixed on his worn boots, unable to meet his gaze. What did one say when offered such a desperate question? What did one feel when ownership was packaged as an invitation? He led her out into the harsh afternoon light, away from the stench of stale beer and desperation. The dust of the street clung to her thin dress, a second skin of neglect. She walked beside him, a small, trembling shadow, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented images. Her mother's faded dress, the empty pantry, the sharp bite of hunger. She remembered the day her father had finally stopped trying, when the light had gone out of his eyes, leaving only a hollow ache. He had said she was a burden, a useless mouth to feed, especially with her silence. The words had not reached her ears, but the raw cruelty in his eyes had. He had sold her like cattle, yes, but it was a transaction born of his own ruin, not her worth. She was a silent echo of his failures, a living testament to all he had lost, or perhaps all he had chosen to abandon. The world had always been a series of muted thumps and distant tremors for Ilara. She could not hear the laughter of children, nor the barking of dogs, nor the angry shouts that often preceded her father's blows. Her world was seen, felt, sometimes tasted, bitter dust, the iron tang of fear, but never truly heard. This John, this rancher, was another unknown. He was a shift in the air, a movement in the landscape, a new potential threat. She didn't look back at the tavern. There was nothing there for her but ghosts, and the lingering shame of being sold. Her scars, invisible to the eye, felt fresh beneath her skin. This journey, whatever it was, could only lead away from what was lost. The ranch was a quiet place, vast and stark beneath the immense prairie sky. A solitary house, built of rough-hewn logs, stood against a backdrop of distant, purple-hued hills. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a sign of warmth and, perhaps, life. Ilara felt a peculiar sense of dread mingle with a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of curiosity. It was different from the clamor of the town, different from the small, crowded shack she had known. Here, the silence felt deeper, wider, swallowing her whole. John led her to the small, dusty cabin behind the main house, a simple dwelling with a single window and a narrow cot. He didn't speak much, merely gesturing with his large hands, his movements slow and deliberate. She watched him, wary as a cornered animal, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What did he expect? What would he demand? She had learned that kindness often concealed a trap, that a gentle touch could precede a blow. He brought her a plate of stew, thick with vegetables and wild game, and a tin cup of water. The aroma, rich and savory, made her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten properly in days, not since her father's last bout of drunken rage had driven her from their meager home. She ate slowly, meticulously, watching him from the corner of her eye as he stoked the small stove. He had a quiet rhythm to him, a deliberate grace that was surprising in such a large man. He didn't hover, didn't make demands. He simply existed in the same space, a comforting, if unsettling, presence. She saw the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the deep creases that spoke of long days under the harsh sun, of a loneliness that seemed to mirror her own. It was a strange thought, that a man could carry such a burden and still offer sustenance to a stranger. That night, curled on the cot, the unfamiliar quiet of the ranch settled around her. The wind outside whispered secrets through the tall grass, a sound she could not hear, but she felt its gentle sigh against the cabin walls. She heard the faint tremor of John's footsteps as he moved about the main house, a dull thud against the earth that resonated through the floor. She heard the distant, guttural howl of a coyote, not with her ears, but with an internal vibration, a deep, primal recognition of its sorrowful call. This was her peculiar gift, or curse, depending on how one viewed it. She could feel the world, sense its subtle shifts, interpret its silent language, a branch snapping, a rock tumbling, a bird taking flight. These created ripples in the air, subtle changes in pressure she could perceive. It wasn't sound, not truly, but a profound awareness of physical displacement, of the world reacting to itself. She wondered if John knew. Did he see her quietness, her inability to respond to spoken words, and assume it was complete deafness? Or did he sense the strange way she sometimes anticipated his movements, turning her head just before he gestured? She didn't know. She hadn't spoken aloud in years, the muscles of her throat unused to the effort. Her voice, a fragile thing she kept hidden, like a secret shame. It was a burden, this silence, this deep quiet that isolated her. But it was also a shield, a way to keep the world at bay, to prevent it from reaching her too deeply. The ranch seemed to hold its breath around her, waiting, and Alara, exhausted, uncertain, and filled with a fragile, dawning hope, simply waited too. The scent of pine and rich earth filled her small room, a new, clean smell compared to the stale air she had known. She clutched the rough blanket to her chin, feeling the presence of the vast, quiet land around her, a safety she had never known. Days bled into weeks, marked by the rising and setting of the immense prairie sun. John continued his quiet routine, working his small ranch, tending to a handful of cattle, mending fences. Ilara observed him, a silent shadow in his periphery. He didn't force her to speak, didn't try to teach her words she couldn't hear. Instead, he communicated through gestures, through the patient unfolding of his workday. He'd point to the small vegetable patch, then to a hoe, inviting her to dig. He'd hold out a pail, then mime, milking a cow. Slowly, haltingly, she began to understand. His hands were large, calloused, but gentle. They spoke a language she could finally comprehend, a language of purpose and simple instruction. Her initial wariness began to soften, like hardened earth slowly absorbing a gentle rain. One afternoon, a bitter wind swept down from the north, carrying the scent of an approaching storm. John was struggling with a stubborn fence post, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ilara, watching him from the cabin door, felt the subtle shift in the air, the agitated tremble of the ground that signaled the wind's mounting fury. She knew, without hearing a single whistle or howl, that the storm would be a fierce one. Hesitantly, she walked towards him, her small frame dwarfed by the vastness of the prairie. She picked up a loose piece of rope, a discarded length of twine, and without a sound, handed it to him. He looked at her, surprised, then at the rope. He understood. He had needed a tie for the post, and she had provided it, silently, instinctively. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a fleeting shadow of warmth in his stoic face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile. That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the cabin walls, a relentless drumming that she felt as a deep, resonant vibration in her bones. The wind howled, a primal force that made the small structure shudder. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her. She huddled beneath the blankets, trembling, remembering other storms, other nights, when her father's drunken rages had mirrored the fury of the sky. But then, a faint light shone beneath her door. John. He pushed the door open, not fully entering, but standing there, a large, reassuring silhouette against the main house's lamplit warmth. He simply stood, a silent sentinel, until the worst of the squall passed. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort her with empty words. His presence, his quiet vigilance, was enough. It was an unspoken promise of safety, a shield against the howling wilderness outside and the lingering ghosts within her. The next morning, the world was fresh and clean, washed by the storm. John found her sketching in the dust outside the cabin with a stick, recreating the intricate patterns of a spider web she had observed. He knelt beside her, his presence a comforting weight. He didn't comment on her drawing, but took a smooth, flat stone from his pocket and drew a simple, crooked line in the dirt beside her web. Then he looked at her, his eyes warm and searching. Elora understood. He was trying to draw, to communicate in her language, a silent offering of connection. It was a tentative step, a fragile bridge built between two solitary souls, forged not with words, but with shared moments of quiet understanding and unexpected kindness. She had been bought, yes, but this man, this John, treated her not as property, but as a person, a choice he made every day. Ilara began to feel a subtle shift within her, a gradual loosening of the tight knots of fear that had bound her for so long. The ranch, once a place of stark uncertainty, was slowly transforming into something akin to a refuge. John's presence, quiet and consistent, was like the steady rhythm of a distant drum she could feel, a constant, grounding force. She found herself watching him more closely, learning his routines, anticipating his needs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, John was struggling to lift a heavy timber beam into place for a new shed. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining. Elara, instinctively, moved to his side. She didn't hesitate. Without a word, she braced herself against the opposite end of the beam, her small body pushing with surprising strength, lending her weight to his. John, caught off guard, stumbled slightly, then steadied himself. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then a deeper understanding. He felt the subtle pressure of her small hands, the unexpected help. He straightened, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, and gave her a slow, deliberate nod of thanks. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of her effort, her choice to help. For Elara, it was a profound moment. She had offered herself, a small measure of her strength, and he had accepted it without question, without judgment. There was no shame in the offering, only an affirmation of shared labor. Later that week, a sudden, violent crack of thunder split the darkening sky. John was inside the main house, startled by the suddenness of it. Ilara, who had been outside gathering kindling, froze. She felt the massive pressure wave, a sudden, violent blow against her entire body. She instinctively braced herself, her hands flying to her head, not to cover her ears, but to contain the overwhelming sensation. John, seeing her reaction from the doorway, noticed the peculiarity. She didn't flinch away from the sound, as much as she seemed to physically absorb the impact. He watched her closely. He had always assumed her deafness was absolute, a void. But he saw the way her eyes darted to the spot where lightning had struck, the way her body tensed before the visible flash, as if she was reacting to something he couldn't perceive. He approached her slowly, signing storm with a simple gesture he'd learned from an old book. Ilara nodded, her small hand reaching out to touch a leaf, trembling from the residual energy of the thunder. He knelt before her, his large hands careful. He held up a finger, then tapped it against his own lips, then pointed to her chest. He was asking if she felt things. Ilara, hesitant but trusting, nodded again. She traced a faint ripple in the air with her finger, then pointed to her own chest, then to her head. It was a clumsy, non-verbal explanation of her unique perception, a revelation she had kept hidden for fear of being deemed stranger than she already was. John's gaze softened. He didn't pity her, didn't look at her with confusion or revulsion. Instead, a quiet wonder settled in his eyes. He didn't say it, but she felt his unspoken understanding, his recognition of a different kind of strength, a different way of being connected to the world. He saw her, not as broken, but as uniquely whole. This shared vulnerability, this silent confession of a hidden truth, deepened the tentative connection between them, laying a fragile foundation of trust. The fragile foundation of trust began to solidify, brick by quiet brick, in the vast, empty space of the prairie. Alara no longer felt like a temporary fixture, a child awaiting the next turn of fate. The ranch, with its familiar smells of dust and pine, of warm bread baking in the hearth, began to feel like a place where she belonged. John, for his part, slowly shed his own mantle of solitude. He started leaving her small gifts: a carved wooden bird, smooth and silent, a piece of ribbon for her hair, a worn book with faded illustrations. These weren't the grand gestures of a hero, but quiet affirmations of her presence, her value, her choice. She found herself mirroring his movements, learning to anticipate the precise moment he would turn from the stove, the exact way he would settle his hand on a fence post. One cold evening, as winter's bitter breath began to sweep across the land, Ilara sat by the hearth, drawing pictures in the dust with a stick. John sat opposite her, polishing an old saddle, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. He paused, his gaze distant, and then, slowly, haltingly, he began to sign, using the simple gestures he'd learned from his book, augmenting them with his own slow, deliberate movements. He spoke of his wife, long gone, taken by a sickness that had swept through the valley years ago. He spoke of the silence she left behind, a vast, echoing emptiness that had settled in his bones. He had tried to fill it with work, with the harsh solitude of the ranch, but the loneliness was a persistent ache, a burden he carried, heavy and unseen. Alara watched his hands, saw the sorrow etched into his weathered face, and felt the familiar tremor of loss that resonated deep within her own being. He was not just signing words, he was revealing a piece of his soul, a wound that mirrored her own. She had been abandoned, left unwanted. He had been left behind, lost. They were two solitary trees in a vast, empty landscape, battered by different storms, yet seeking the same shelter. Without thinking, she reached out, her small hand gently touching his calloused one. It was a gesture of profound empathy, a wordless acknowledgement of shared grief, of the quiet understanding that binds souls. From that day, a different current flowed between them, not just the quiet work of a rancher in his unexpected ward, but the tentative, fragile beginnings of a family. They shared meals, not just food, but the silent companionship of two people finding comfort in each other's presence. Elara's scars, though still present, began to feel less like open wounds and more like faded etchings, symbols of a past she had survived, not burdens that defined her. John found a quiet strength in her resilience, a gentle mirroring of his own enduring spirit. The ranch, once a place of grim duty for him, now held the warmth of a hearth, the promise of belonging. He had brought her here, ostensibly, to save her from destitution. But in the silent, unassuming way she had started to fill the empty spaces in his life, he realized she was also, in her own quiet way, healing him. They were two souls finding each other, not through heroic acts, but through the profound, understated beauty of simple kindness and shared solitude. The fragile peace that had settled over the ranch, like a soft blanket of snow, began to melt under the unwelcome glare of community scrutiny. Word, as it always did in these small, isolated settlements, had spread. A solitary rancher, a man known for his quiet, almost reclusive nature, had taken in a child. And not just any child, a black girl, and one who was rumored to be deaf. Whispers, unseen but felt, began to ripple through the valley, carried on the chilling winds of judgment. Alara felt their vibrations, sharp and unsettling, long before any direct confrontation. She sensed the way the air shifted when John took her into town for supplies, the way gazes lingered, cold and appraising. Mrs. Albright, a formidable woman whose piety was as sharp as her tongue, cornered John outside the general store. Her voice, though Alara couldn't hear the words, was a harsh, clipped vibration that made the ground beneath her feet feel brittle. John stood tall, his posture unwavering, but Elara felt the tension coil in his broad shoulders. Mrs. Albright's hand gestures were sharp, accusatory, pointing first at Elara, then making a circular motion around her ear. She was asking about Elara's deafness, questioning its truth, perhaps even its legitimacy. Elara knew the implied accusation, that she was a burden, a charity case, or worse, a cunning trick. The shame, a familiar, unwelcome guest, prickled at her skin. It ain't natural, Elara felt Mrs. Albright's unspoken condemnation, delivered through the woman's rigid posture and the sudden, uneasy silence of the other townsfolk. A girl like that, with her condition, it's a burden on a good Christian man. John, his face etched with a quiet resolve, offered no explanation, no apology. He merely shook his head, his refusal clear, his loyalty unwavering. He guided Elara away, his hand a solid, comforting weight on her shoulder. But the seeds of doubt, once sown, were difficult to uproot. The threat wasn't a physical one, not yet, but a subtle, insidious poisoning of their fragile haven, a constant tension between their quiet belonging and the expectations of the wider world. The rumors grew bolder. Soon, accusations of John exploiting her, of her being not truly deaf for some nefarious purpose, reached their ears. A local deputy, a young man with more ambition than sense, even rode out to the ranch, his presence a jarring intrusion into their peace. He asked John questions, his voice a low rumble, but Elara felt the tremor of his suspicion, the implied threat behind his polite inquiries. He wanted to know how Elara communicated, how she understood. John, ever patient, demonstrated their simple gestures, the way they moved through their days in silent understanding. But the deputy's eyes, Elara felt, were cold, unseeing, unwilling to accept what was plainly before him. They saw strangeness where there was only a different kind of truth. This external pressure, this looming shadow of community judgment, began to feel like a winter storm, gathering strength, threatening to engulf the small, fragile family they had become. Elara felt a familiar dread, the fear that this fragile safety, this hard-won belonging, would be taken from her once more. The storm of whispers finally broke into a squall of direct confrontation. One frosty morning, a small group of townsfolk, led by Mrs. Albright and joined by the ambitious deputy, arrived at the ranch. Their horses stomped impatiently, sending plumes of breath into the cold air. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their judgment, a harsh, metallic tang that Elara felt deep in her chest. John stepped out of the house, his posture firm, his face set. He did not invite them in. He stood between them and Elara, a silent, unyielding bulwark. Mrs. Albright, her voice cutting through the crisp air, accused John of harboring a burden, of defying God's will by taking in a defective child. The deputy, emboldened by the crowd, then stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Elara. "They say she ain't truly deaf," he signed clumsily, mimicking speech. "They say she hears enough when it suits her." Elara felt the harsh tremor of his voice, the raw accusation, and her blood ran cold. The old shame, the feeling of being unwanted, misunderstood, resurfaced, sharp and painful. She clenched her small hands, fighting the urge to flee, to disappear into the vastness of the prairie. John's jaw tightened. He turned to the deputy, his voice low, firm, a rumble that resonated through the earth. "She hears what matters," he said, his words few but weighty. "She hears kindness. She hears truth, more than most folks in this valley." He turned back to Mrs. Albright, his gaze unwavering. "She ain't broken, she's strong. Stronger than any of you give her credit for." It was a declaration, a stark statement of loyalty, a choice made in the face of judgment. Elara felt the shift in the air, the collective intake of breath from the crowd. John was not just defending her, he was choosing her, publicly, unequivocally. As the argument escalated, with the townsfolk demanding Elara be sent to an institution or returned to her father, a sudden, violent vibration struck the ground. Elara, instinctively, reacted. She gasped, her eyes widening, and pointed urgently towards the south pasture. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. A deep, guttural tremor that no one else seemed to notice. John, seeing her distress, her absolute certainty, followed her gaze. Moments later, a faint, terrified bleating reached his ears, a sound that quickly intensified. A small group of their sheep, spooked by something unseen, were running frantically, heading directly for a broken section of fence near a treacherous ravine. Alara had sensed the stampede before anyone heard it. Her peculiar hearing had given them a warning. Without a word, John sprinted towards the pasture, the deputy and the townsfolk momentarily forgotten in the face of a tangible threat. Alara, without hesitation, followed, her small legs pumping, driven by an urgent need to help, to protect what was now theirs. Her loyalty, unspoken but absolute, was proven not in words, but in her immediate, instinctive action. The moral tension between freedom and belonging, between community judgment and their quiet bond, was suddenly superseded by the immediate danger. John was fighting for his herd, and Alara, the unwanted burden, was fighting by his side, proving her worth not by convention, but by an undeniable, profound connection to the land and its creatures. John ran with a desperate urgency, his long strides covering the ground quickly. The deputy and a few of the younger men, startled by the sudden crisis, eventually joined the chase, spurred by the rancher's decisive action. Alara, despite her smaller stature, kept pace, her senses honed by the impending disaster. She felt the panicked thud of the sheep's hooves against the earth, the frantic vibration of their flight, the subtle, shifting currents of air as they veered dangerously close to the broken fence. She was like a silent sentinel, guiding John with her rapid, urgent gestures, pointing to the precise breach in the old, crumbling wire. When they reached the fence line, a few sheep had already pushed through, teetering precariously close to the ravine's edge. John, without a moment's hesitation, plunged forward, his hands reaching, grabbing, pulling the frightened animals back from the precipice. The deputy, realizing the immediate danger, finally acted, helping to round up the stragglers. Alara, meanwhile, found a large, fallen branch. With surprising strength, she began to drag it towards the gap, trying to create a temporary barrier. It was a small act, but critical, as it helped to contain the remaining herd. Her desperation was mistaken for weakness by some, but for John, it was a profound display of courage and connection. After what felt like an eternity, the sheep were safe, though trembling, gathered into a makeshift pen. John stood, panting, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked at Alara, who was wiping the dust from her own face, her eyes wide with the residue of fear and the quiet pride of contribution. He didn't speak. He knelt, then pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace. It was a silent, powerful affirmation of their bond, a moment of profound recognition. He held her tightly, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The townspeople, who had watched the unfolding crisis, now stood in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. They had come to judge, to condemn, but they had witnessed an undeniable act of shared courage, a symbiotic relationship between a man and a child they had dismissed. The deputy, clearing his throat, finally spoke, his voice much softer than before. She sensed it, didn't she? Before we heard a thing. He looked at Alara with a new, hesitant respect, no longer seeing a burden, but a unique, invaluable member of the ranch. John simply nodded, his arm still around Alara, drawing her closer. There was no need for grand pronouncements. The truth was evident in the rescued sheep, in the shared effort, in Alara's remarkable perception. Her deafness was not a lack, but a different kind of strength, a profound connection to the world around her, a sensory understanding that transcended their own. The crisis had passed, and in its wake, an unspoken acceptance had begun to bloom. The community's judgment had been met with a quiet, undeniable truth, and for the first time, Alara felt the weight of their disapproval lift, replaced by a fragile, dawning sense of genuine belonging. She was not just safe. She was truly seen. The incident with the stampeding sheep had quieted the wagging tongues, though the whispers never fully vanished. Mrs. Albright still gave them icy stares in town, and the deputy, while no longer openly hostile, remained wary. But their collective judgment had lost its sharpest edge. The ranch, once a place of quiet refuge, now felt like a bastion, a small, strong fortress against the fickle winds of public opinion. Alara and John settled back into their rhythms, a routine forged in shared labor and silent understanding. The days stretched long and warm, punctuated by the rhythmic chores of ranch life. Alara helped gather eggs, feed the chickens, and weed the garden. Her hands, once small and trembling, grew strong and capable. The new shed was finished, a testament to their combined efforts. Within its sturdy walls, Alara helped John stack hay, the sweet scent of dried grass filling the air. She observed how the light shifted through the cracks in the wooden planks, how the dust motes danced in the sunbeams. She could feel the subtle shift in the air temperature as the seasons turned, the deep cold of winter giving way to the gentle warmth of spring. Her unique perception of the world, once a source of isolation and shame, had become a quiet strength, a way to connect more deeply with the land and with John. He often consulted her on changes in the weather, noting the accuracy of her unspoken forecasts. One afternoon, John found her sitting by the creek, carefully sketching the intricate root system of an old, gnarled tree in her worn notebook. He sat beside her, the grass rustling softly around them. He pointed to the sketch, then to the tree, then back to her. "Roots?" he sighed, his large fingers forming the word slowly. "Like us. Here. Deep." Alara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the blue of the sky. She understood. The scars of her past, the abandonment, the feeling of being unwanted, were still there, like the rough bark of the tree, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were part of her history, part of the strength that allowed her to grow, to sink roots into this new, solid ground. She still didn't speak aloud, not often. The words felt cumbersome, unnecessary, in their shared language of gestures and knowing glances. But sometimes, when John was asleep or when she was alone tending to the animals, she would whisper words to herself, testing the sound, the feel of them on her tongue. Her voice was thin, reedy, unused, but it was there, a quiet affirmation of her own existence. She had a choice now. The possibility of leaving, of seeking a different life, was always present, a faint, distant hum. But here, on this ranch, with this quiet, kind man, she had found something she had never dared to dream of: safety, belonging, a profound sense of not being broken. It was a bittersweet peace, knowing the world outside could still be cruel, but finding solace and strength within the quiet walls of their shared home. The loneliness that had shadowed her life had slowly, quietly, begun to recede, replaced by the profound hum of a life truly lived. Years passed, marked not by dramatic events, but by the steady rhythm of seasons, of planting and harvest, of long sun-drenched days and star-strewn nights. Alara grew from a small, wary child into a thoughtful, capable young woman. Her unique perception, her ability to hear the world through vibrations and subtle shifts in air, became an indispensable asset to the ranch, an extension of John's own intuition. She could sense approaching storms long before the first cloud appeared, anticipate changes in the herd's behavior, and navigate the treacherous terrain with a silent grace that often astonished those who still clung to their initial judgments. Her silence remained, not as a burden, but as a testament to her profound connection to a world most people merely skimmed the surface of. John, now older, his hair flecked with more gray, watched her with a quiet pride that needed no words. The lines of sorrow on his face had softened, replaced by a peaceful contentment. The ranch, once a solitary echo of his grief, now hummed with a different kind of life, a quiet vibrancy born of their shared existence. They were not father and daughter by blood, but by a deeper, more enduring bond forged in kindness, understanding, and the unwavering choice to stand by one another. He had given her safety, a place to belong, but she had given him back a purpose, a sense of family he thought was forever lost. Their love was a quiet thing, a steady flame against the vast prairie wind, never loud, always true. The community's skepticism had largely faded, replaced by a grudging respect. Some even sought Alara's unusual wisdom, asking her about the weather, or the health of their own livestock, acknowledging, albeit silently, the strange power of her quiet perception. She was still an anomaly, an outsider in some ways, but she was no longer unwanted. She had carved out her own space, not through conformity, but through her unwavering authenticity. The scars of her past, the shame of being sold, the sting of abandonment, remained. They were etched into her memory, a part of her story. But they no longer defined her. They were simply reminders of how far she had come, how much she had endured, and how much she had found. On clear nights, Ilara and John would sometimes sit on the porch, watching the stars blaze in the inky blackness above them. John would point out constellations, signing their names, and Ilara would feel the ancient, distant hum of the cosmos, a profound vibration that connected her to something immense and eternal. She was not broken. She was whole, uniquely so, connected to the world in a way few could comprehend. Her life was a quiet win, not a heroic triumph, but a profound affirmation of chosen family, of loyalty, and of the enduring power of human kindness to heal even the deepest wounds. The ranch was no longer just a place on a map. It was the heart of their belonging, a sanctuary built on trust, a place where a deaf girl sold by her drunk father had found her voice, not through sound, but through the profound, resonant silence of a love that was truly heard.